Okay, so we are reading it's The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. We are in the chapter The Interpersonal Ethic, page number 214 of the book and 119 of the PDF.
She glanced at me for an instant as she drove, because any one adult can only focus on and give attention to one child at a time. If there are too many children for the number of adults, then the adults become overwhelmed and unable to give enough energy. The children begin to compete with each other for the adults' time.
Okay, so this again brings us to the point that you can really do one thing at one time. Now, over here, this was the beauty of the joint family system, where there were many adults in the family setup, and they could give attention to the children. So most of the families, you would find that one of the children became the favorite of one of the adults, and they used to give special attention to that particular child. So this is, I think, what she's talking about here. Shwanda.
Sibling rivalry, I said. Yes, but the manuscript says that this problem is more important than people think. Adults often glamorize the idea of large families and children growing up together. But children should learn the world from adults, not from other children. In too many cultures, children are running in gangs. The manuscript says humans will slowly understand that they should not bring children into the world unless there is at least one adult committed to focus full attention all of the time on each child.
So again, over here again, what happens is that if the child is not given enough attention in the family, they start looking for attention elsewhere. Number one. Number two, many times what also happens, what we have been seeing is that the authority should flow from the adult to the child, not from the child to the adult. So if the child is learning from another child, the kind of things that the child learns will naturally be not be to the level that an adult can actually teach the child. This was again one of the reasons that leaving children with grandparents was a very, very important kind of a phenomenon in most cultures, because children learnt a lot from the grandparents also. Now, if there are too many children, then they're all competing for attention, which again creates a crab mentality in them. Unless there is all the adults are very, very centered and they really know what they are doing, it can create a problem among siblings.
But wait a minute, I said. In many situations, both parents must work to survive. This denies them the right to have children? Not necessarily, she replied. The manuscript says humans will learn to extend their families beyond blood ties so that someone else is able to provide one on one attention. All the energy does not have to come from the parents alone. In fact, it is better if it does not. But whoever cares for the children must provide this one on one attention.
So again, what we were talking about, that Robert Holbrook was saying that in that village, everyone was operating in F12. So everything just happened. So if you really see, it's not necessary that only the parent needs to look after the child. It can become a family kind of a setup, but with one person paying more attention to the child, to each of the child, so you have to take up the upbringing of one child at a time.
Well, I said, you've done something right. Maretta certainly seems mature. Carla frowned and said, don't tell me, tell her. Oh, right. I looked at the child. You act very grown up, Maretta. She looked away shyly for a moment, then said, thank you. Kala hugged her warmly. Kala looked at me proudly. For the last 2 years, I have been trying to relate to Moretta according to the manuscript's guidelines. Haven't I, Moretta? The child smiled and nodded. I have tried to give her energy and to always tell her the truth of every situation in language she can understand. When she asked the questions a young child asks, I treated them very seriously, avoiding the temptation of giving her a fanciful answer, which is plainly for the entertainment of adults.
So now, over here, it's very clear that we need to speak to the child in very clear terms, not just make a fanciful story. So saying the truth, like again in the four agreements we had seen, that be impeccable with your word. Okay. So we can't weave a story for children. We should be as clear as possible and explain it to them in the language that they can understand. Okay. So it becomes very important that we do this.
You were frozen.
I'm not frozen. Which net are you using, Shivangla? Which network are you using?
One second, I'm just telling you. Geo fifth floor.
No, to use CBS, no?
Bhaiya,
Yes,
wasn't
Are
this
you there?
mentioned also in the book, The Magical Child?
absolutely. In the Magical Child, what did they say? That the mother is the first matrix. Okay. And as the child grows up, the matrices start to expand, and the father also starts playing a part somewhere along the third matrix. So again, this matrix growth system is very, very important. In the same thing they're saying here, that attention needs to be given to the child. Now, if the child is not given the attention and doesn't have the security of the first matrix, then it automatically creates a problem when the child grows up. And this we are finding in biofield tuning also, that if you are having a problem in your childhood, it will keep repeating as a pattern in your adult life. So that's why it becomes very, very important.
Thank you, Bhaiya.
I smiled. Do you mean untruths like storks bring babies, that sort of thing? Yes, but these cultural expressions aren't so bad. Children figure these out quickly because they stay the same. Worse are the distortions created on the spot by adults just because they want to have a little fun and because they believe the truth is too complicated for a child to comprehend. But this is not right. The truth can always be expressed at a child's level of understanding. It just takes some thought.
So all of us have heard stories. Shivangla, you have to change your mic's speaker setting in your system.
Are
Okay,
you
so
ready?
all of us have heard stories when we are growing up, and if they stay the same, it's repeated over and over, it's all right. But distortions, like many times, a parent will tell someone that you were adopted. Now that creates a lot of problems later on going ahead. So we have to be very careful with what we tell children, because when they are growing up, they pick up a lot and they follow by example. So you have to be very clear and be sure that your child is watching you, and whatever you are doing, the child is going to pick up. So don't be surprised if the child is going to do exactly what you do. And then later on, if you tell the child not to do it, they're going to turn around and tell you, you did it. Why are you telling me not to do it? So you have to lead by example. So that's why paying attention to the children becomes very, very important.
What does the manuscript say about this issue? It says we should always find a way to tell a child the truth. Part of me resisted this idea. I was the one who enjoyed kidding around with children. Don't kids usually understand that adults are just playing? I said. All this seems to make them grow up too fast and take some of the fun out of childhood. She looked at me sternly. Maretta is full of fun. We chase and tumble and play all the childhood fantasy games. The difference is that when we are fantasizing, she knows it.
So
I
now it's very important that that distinction be created, that what is the truth and when are we fooling around. Okay, so we need to have a lot of clarity when we are communicating with children.
nodded. She was right, of course. Maretta seems confident, Kala continued, because I was there for her. I gave her one on one attention when she needed it. And if I wasn't there, my sister, who lives next door, was there. She always had an adult to answer her questions, and because she has had time, this sincere attention, she has never felt she had to act out or show off. She has always had enough energy, and that makes her assume she will continue to have enough, which makes the transition from receiving energy from adults to getting it from the universe, which we already talk about, much easier for her to grasp.
So again, this is clearly the matrix playing out, right? You move from the mother to the external environment, to the abstract, to the spiritual. So you are moving into that direction.
I noticed the terrain outside. We were traveling through deep jungle now, and though I couldn't see it, I knew the sun was low in the afternoon sky. Can we get to Equators tonight? I asked. No, Carla said, but we can stay at a house I know. Near here? I asked. Yes, it is the house of a friend. He works for the Wildlife Service. He works for the government? Some of the Amazon is a protected area. He is the local agent, but influential. His name is Juan. Do not worry, he believes in the manuscript and they have never bothered him. By the time we arrived, the sky was completely dark. Around us, the jungle was alive with night sounds, the air muggy. A large, well lit wooden frame house stood at the end of a clearing in the dense foliage. Nearby were two large buildings and several jeeps. Another vehicle was up on blocks, and two men worked around lights underneath. A thin Peruvian dressed in expensive clothing answered Carla's knock and smiled at her until he noticed Marjorie, Maretta, and myself waiting on the steps. His face turned nervous and displeased as he talked to her in Spanish. She said something pleadingly in return, but his mannerism and inflection indicated that he did not want us to stay. Then, through the crack in the door, I noticed a lone female figure standing in the foyer. I moved a little to bring her face into view. It was Julia. As I looked, she turned her head and saw me, then quickly walked forward with a surprised look on her face. She touched the shoulder of the man at the door and said something quietly into his ear. The man nodded, then opened the door with a look of resignation. We all introduced ourselves as Hinton led the way into the den area. Julia looked at me and said, "We meet again." She wore khaki pants with pockets on the legs and a bright red t shirt. "Yes, we do," I said. A Peruvian servant stopped Hinton, and after talking for a minute, the two walked into another part of the house. Julia sat in a chair by a coffee table and motioned for the rest of us to sit on a couch across from her. Marjorie appeared panicked. She looked at me intensely. Carla also seemed to be aware of Marjorie's distress. She walked over and took her by the hand. "Let's get some hot tea," she suggested. As they walked away, Marjorie glanced back at me. I smiled and watched them until they turned the corner into the kitchen. Then I turned to face Julia. So, what do you think it means? She asked. What does what mean? I replied, still distracted. That we have run into each other again? Oh, I don't know. How did you wind up with Carla and where are you going? She saved us. Marjorie and I had been detained by Peruvian troops. When we escaped, she happened to be there to help us. Julia looked intense. Tell me what occurred. I leaned back and told her the whole story, beginning at the point in which I had taken Father Carl's truck and then all about the capture and our eventual escape. And Carla agreed to take you to Iquitos? Julia asked. Yes. Why do you want to go there? That's where Will told Father Carl he was going. Will apparently has a lead about the ninth insight. Also, Sebastian is there for some reason. Julia nodded. Yes, Sebastian has a mission near there. It's where he made his reputation, converting the Indians. What about you? I asked. What are you doing here? Julia told me that she too wanted to find the ninth insight, but that she had no leads. She had come to this house after thinking repeatedly of her old friend Hinton. I was hardly listening. Marjorie and Carla had walked out of the kitchen and were standing in the hall talking, cups of tea in their hands. Marjorie caught my eye but said nothing. Has she read much of the manuscript? Julia asked, nodding towards Marjorie. Just the third insight, I said. We can probably get her out of Peru if that's what she wants. I turned and looked at her. How? Rolando is leaving tomorrow for Brazil. We have some friends at the American embassy there. They can get her back to the United States. We have helped other Americans this way. I looked at her and nodded tentatively. I realized I was having mixed feelings about what she had said. Part of me knew that leaving would be best for Marjorie, but another part wanted her to stay, to remain with me. I felt changed, energized when she was around. I think I need to talk with her, I finally said. Of course, Julia replied. We can talk later.
So again, over here, but another part of me wanted her to stay, to remain with me. I felt changed, energized when she was around. So when people fall in love, when they are feeling loving feelings, automatically they get energized and everything starts moving correctly. It's also said that we have two times that maximum neural growth takes place. It is the time when we are from the age of 1 to 6, and when we in during puberty, when we actually rise in love. You shouldn't say fall in love. When we rise in love, that is the time when maximum neural growth takes place. Okay, so whenever we are in that state of consciousness, automatically everything seems brighter, we are more efficient, we can do get more things done, etc. So naturally he has feelings for Marjorie. Because of that, he is feeling very nice when she is around.
I got up and walked towards her. Carla was heading back towards the kitchen. Marjorie stepped around the corner of the hall out of sight. When I walked up, she was leaning back against the wall. I pulled Marjorie into my arms. My body pulsated. Feel that energy? I asked, whispering into her ear. It's incredible, she said. What does it mean? I don't know. We have some kind of connection. I glanced around. No one could see us. We kissed passionately. When I pulled back to look at her face, she looked different, stronger somehow, and I thought back to the day we had met at Vicient and to the conversation in the restaurant at Kula. I couldn't believe the amount of energy I felt in her presence and when she touched me. She held me tightly. Since that day at Vicien, she said, I've wanted to be with you. I didn't know what to think about it then, but the energy is wonderful. I've never experienced anything like this. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Carla walking up, smiling. She told us that dinner was ready, so we made our way into the dining room and found a huge buffet of fresh fruits and vegetables and breads. Everyone served their plates and sat around a large table. After Moretta sang a blessing song, we spent an hour and a half eating and talking casually. Hinton had lost his nervousness and he set a light hearted mood, which helped to ease the tension of our escape. Marjorie was talking freely and laughing. Sitting beside her filled me with warm love. After dinner, Hinton took us back into the den where a custard dessert was served with a sweet liqueur. Marjorie and I sat on the couch and fell into a long conversation about our past and significant life experiences. We seemed to grow closer and closer. The only difficulty we discovered was that she lived on the west coast and I resided in the south. Later, Marjorie dismissed the problem and laughed heartily. I can't wait until we get back to the United States, she said. We'll have so much fun traveling back and forth. I sat back and gave her a serious look. Julia said she could arrange a way for you to go home now. You mean both of us, don't you? She replied. No, I can't go. Why? She asked. I can't leave without you, but I can't stand to stay here any longer either. I'll go crazy. You'll have to go on ahead. I'll be able to leave soon. No, she said loudly. I can't stand that. Carla, who was walking back into the den from putting Meretta in bed, glanced towards us, then looked quickly away. Hinton and Julia were still talking, seemingly oblivious to Marjorie's outburst. Please, Marjorie said, let's just go home. I looked away. Okay, fine, she said, stay. She stood and walked briskly towards the bedroom area. My gut wrenched as I watched Marjorie walk away. The energy I had gained with her collapsed, and I suddenly felt weak and confused. I tried to shake it off. After all, I told myself I hadn't known her that long. On the other hand, I thought maybe she was correct. Maybe I should just go home. What difference could I make here anyway? Back at home, I could perhaps marshal some support for the reason I sat.
उन लोग क्या पूरा हो जाएगा वो पेपर वर्क तब?
Yeah, just 1 second. Hold on, Shivangla. Someone's knocking. कौन है? क्या हुआ? छोड़ दीजिए. और कुछ चाहिए? Okay, sorry. Chal.
My gut wrenched as I watched Marjorie walk away. The energy I had gained with her collapsed, and I suddenly felt very weak and confused. I tried to shake it off. After all, I told myself I hadn't known her that long. On the other hand, I thought maybe she was correct. Maybe I should just go home. What difference could I make here anyway? Back at home, I could perhaps marshal some support for the manuscript and stay alive as well. I stood up and started to follow her down the hall, but for some reason I sat back down. I couldn't decide what to do. May I join you for a minute? Carla was suddenly asking. I hadn't noticed that she was standing beside the sofa. Sure, I said. She sat down and looked at me with regard. I couldn't help overhearing what is going on. She said, and I thought that before you made your decision, you might want to hear what the eighth inside When
Shivangla.
one first learns to be clear and to engage one's evolution, any of us can be stopped suddenly by an addiction to another person. You're speaking of Marjorie and me, aren't you? Let me explain the process, she said, and you judge for yourself. Okay, first, let me say that I had a very hard time with this part of the insight. I don't think I would have ever understood if I had not met Professor Renew. Renew? I exclaimed. I know him. We met when I was learning the fourth insight. Well, she said, we met when we both had reached the eighth insight. He stayed at my house for several days. I nodded in amazement. He said that the idea of an addiction, as used in the manuscript, explains why power struggles arise in romantic relationships. We've always wondered what causes the bliss and euphoria of love to end, to suddenly turn into conflict, and now we know. It is a result of the flow of energy between the individuals involved.
So now, what happens in the beginning? Shivangla, you have to lower your speaker volume.
Okay.
So in the beginning, what happens is that when people are in love, they're constantly giving each other love. I mean, each other energy. The they will do overdo for each other. After some time, they start becoming more selfish and self-centered, and they want more energy for themselves because they are not giving each other energy anymore. And that is when the conflict starts. That is when the fighting starts.
When love first happens, the two individuals are giving each other energy unconsciously, and both people feel buoyant and elated. That's the incredible high we all call being in love. Unfortunately, once they expect this feeling to become from the other person, they cut themselves off from the energy in the universe and begin to rely even more on the energy from each other. Only now there doesn't seem to be enough, and so they stop giving each other energy and fall back into their dramas in an attempt to control each other and force the other's energy their way. At this point, the relationship degenerates into the usual path struggle.
So now what is happening over here? Now, as we disconnect from the universal energy, and we once we disconnect, we get out of our equanimity, our equilibrium, we start wanting to go into our basic control drama that we have been performing since the beginning. The four control dramas being the intimidator, the interrogator, the aloof, and the poor me. We again fall back into one of those control dramas to grab energy from the other person. Okay, and that is when the conflict again starts, because control drama always leads to a conflict.
She hesitated for a moment, as if checking whether I understood, then added, Renew told me that our susceptibility to this kind of addiction can be described psychologically if that will help you understand. I nodded again for her to continue. Renew said, the problem starts in our early family. Because of the energy competition there, none of us were able to compete an important psychological process. Sorry, I need to read this again. I nodded again for her to continue. Renew said the problem starts in our early family. Because of the energy competition there, none of us were able to complete an important psychological process. We weren't able to integrate our opposite sexual side. Our what? In my case, she continued, I wasn't able to integrate my male side. In your case, you weren't able to integrate your female side. The reason we can become addicted to someone of the opposite sex is that we've yet to access this opposite sex energy ourselves. You see, the mystical energy that we can tap as an inner source is both male and female. We can eventually open up to it But when we first begin to evolve, we have to be careful. The integration process takes some time. If we connect prematurely with a human source for our female or male energy, we block the universal supply.
So again, it is Ida and Pingala. Okay. The Ardhanareshwari concept. We have to access both the sides of energy through the universal consciousness. And if we don't and we start getting it from a physical person, then that creates a problem. That's why exposure too much to the opposite sex at an inappropriate time can become a problem.
I told her I didn't understand. Think of how this integration is supposed to work in an ideal family, she explained. And then perhaps you can see what I mean. In any family, the child must first receive energy from the adults in his life, usually identifying with and integrating the energy of the same sexed parent is accomplished easily. But receiving energy from the other parent can be more difficult because of the differences in the sexes. Let's use a female child as an example. All the little girl knows as she first attempts to integrate her male side is that she is extremely attracted to her father. She wants him around and close to her all the time. The manuscript explains that what she really wants is male energy, because this male energy complements her female side. From this male energy, she receives a sense of completion and euphoria, but she mistakenly thinks that the only way to have this energy is by sexually possessing her father and keeping him close physically. Interestingly, because she intuits that this energy is really supposed to be her own and that she should be able to command this energy at will, she wants to direct the father as if he were part of herself. She thinks he is magical and perfect and able to supply her every whim. In a less than ideal family, this sets up a power conflict between the little girl and her dad. Dramas are formed as she learns to posture herself in order to manipulate him into giving her the energy she desires.
So again, it leads to a control drama, which is the basic problem.
But in an ideal family, the father would remain uncompetitive. He would continue to relate honestly and have enough energy so as to supply her unconditionally, even though he can't do everything she asks. The important thing to know here is our ideal example is that the father would remain open and communicative. She thinks he is ideal and magical, but if he honestly explains who he is and what he is doing and why, then the little girl can integrate his particular style and abilities and proceed past an unrealistic view of her father. In the end, she will see him as a human being with his own talents and faults. Once this true emulation takes place, then the child makes an easy transition from receiving her opposite sex energy from her father to receiving it as part of the overall energy existing in the universe at large.
So again, the father has to be truthful with the child, with what he can and what he can't do.
The problem, she went on, is that most parents up to now have been competing with their own children for energy, and that has affected all of us. Because this competition was taking place, none of us have quite resolved this opposite sex issue. We are all stuck at the stage where we are still looking for our opposite sex energy outside of ourselves, in the person of a male or female we can think of as ideal and magical and can possess sexually. See the problem?
So again, it's a matter of balancing our energies internally. So if we can connect and create a balance between the left and the right side, with between the heart and the brain, we can automatically create this balance within us.
Yes, I said. I think I do. In terms of our ability to evolve consciously, she continued, we are faced with a critical situation. As I said before, according to the eighth insight, when we first begin to evolve, we automatically begin to receive our opposite sex energy. It comes in naturally from the energy in the universe. But we must be careful because if another person comes along who offers this energy directly, we can cut ourselves off from the true source and regress. She chuckled to herself.
So now again, this becomes important. And that's why it's so important to make this connection for youngsters, to make these connections for the child so that they can get universal energy into their system rather than wanting to grab it from another living being.
What are you laughing at? I asked. Renew once made this analogy, she said. He said that until we learn how to avoid this situation, we are walking around like a circle half complete. You know, we look like the letter C. We are very susceptible to a person of the opposite sex, some other circle half complete, coming up and joining with us, completing the circle that way, and giving us a burst of euphoria and energy that feels like the wholeness that a full connection with the universe produces. In reality, we have only joined up with another person who is looking for their other half on the outside too.
So now this happens, when you start getting really, really, truly infatuated with someone, and then that person gives the energy back to you, and then you get stuck in that vicious cycle. And normally, what happens, I've seen that the breakup becomes very, very painful because both sides don't want to leave, but they have to quit because they realize that they are sucking each other out rather than creating value for each other.
Renew said that this is a classical codependent relationship and that it has built in problems that begin to arise immediately. She hesitated as though she expected me to say something, but I only nodded. You see, the problem with this completed person, this zero, that both people think they have reached, is that it has taken two people to make this one whole person, one supplying the female energy and one supplying the male. This one whole person consequently has two heads or egos. Both people want to run this whole person they have created, and so, just as in childhood, both people want to command the other as if the other were themselves. This kind of illusion of completeness always breaks down into a power struggle. In the end, each person must take the other for granted and even invalidate them so that they can lead this whole self in the direction they want to go. But of course, that doesn't work, at least not anymore. Perhaps in the past, one of the partners was willing to submit themselves to the other, usually the woman, sometimes the man. But we are waking up now. No one wants to be subservient to anyone else any longer.
So this becomes very important, right? In the end, each person must take the other for granted and even invalidate them. Why? Because if they have validity, then you cannot be the leader of the whole. So that's why the other partner is constantly wanting to grapple and put the other partner down because they want to lead the entire whole. If they are not given that ability and they are not getting the energy that they want, the opposite energy from the universal consciousness, there is a constant grappling for power, which again creates the power struggle. So this we all must be very, very aware of this, right? All Most of us here have spouses, and if we are indulging in this kind of activity where we are not allowing freedom to our partners, it will automatically all the time become a problem. Okay, so we have to be very careful of this, and we need to give each other the freedom to function as we all would like to function. Okay, when we try to impose on the other person too much, that is where the problem starts coming. We want to lead the other person, spoon feed the other person, and that really becomes a problem. That freedom becomes very important if we want to grow as a couple, to become more resilient as a couple.
I thought of what the first insight had conveyed about power struggles within intimate relationships and of the woman's outburst at the restaurant with Charlene. So much for romance, I said. Oh, we can still have romance, Carla replied. But first, we have to complete the circle on our own. We have to stabilize our channel with the universe. That takes time, but afterwards, we are never susceptible to this problem again, and we can have what the manuscript calls a higher relationship. When we connect romantically with another whole person after that, we create a super person, but it never pulls us from the path of our individual evolution.
So now this becomes very important. So that means that you give each other the freedom to evolve in the way that you need to evolve, and throughout the process supporting each other. Because if one spouse wants the other spouse to do exactly what that spouse says, that is where the problem starts coming. Because every one of us individually is in their own path of evolution. We all have our own agenda of being here. So we have to go through the experiences that we have decided that we want to experience if we want to feel complete. If we do not have the experience, or we are restricted from having the experience that we had decided before we came here to have, that is where the problem starts to lie. So that's why within a relationship, we must give freedom to each other to evolve in the way that we would like to, or we need to evolve, and the agenda that we have set for ourselves when we come down here. So that's why force feeding or really putting too much pressure on another spouse is not the way that we need to go. And that's where the power struggle comes, and all the relationships start to break down when you have a power struggle.
When we connect romantically with another whole person after that, we create a super person, but it never pulls us from the path of our individual evolution. Which is what you think Marjorie and I are doing to each other right now, isn't it? Pulling ourselves off our paths? Yes. So, how do we avoid these encounters? I asked.
So now what was Marjorie doing? Marjorie wanted back to go back. Now Marjorie's level of evolution and his level of evolution, there's a distinction now, because she's still operating at the third insight level. He's operating at the eighth insight level. So now there's a distinction. So Marjorie wants to pull him out, although he is willing to allow her to lead her life and lead his life separately, right? But Marjorie, because she's at a lower energy level, still wants to grab energy from him. So, in effect, wanting to pull him down.
By resisting the love at first sight feeling for a while, by learning to have platonic relationships with members of the opposite sex. But remember the process. You must have these relationships only with people who will reveal themselves totally, telling you how and why they are doing what they are doing, what they are understanding, who these opposite, sorry, I'm reading this again. By resisting the love at first sight feeling for a while, by learning to have platonic relationships with members of the opposite sex.
Okay, one second. So now over here, what is happening? When you just, that right at that first shot, if you say that, no, this is the one for me, it can actually become a problem, because later on, that feeling cannot be sustained. So, what we need to understand is to go into a relationship with understanding. The level of consciousness has to match if we want the relationship to go ahead. And there always has to be a give and take in any kind of relationship, not a holding back in any relationship.
But remember the process. You must have these relationships only with people who will reveal themselves totally, telling you how and why they are doing what they are doing, just as this would have happened with the opposite sex parent during an ideal childhood. By understanding who these opposite sexed friends really are on the inside, one breaks past one's own fantasy projection about that gender, and that releases us to connect again with the universe.
So now we all have a concept, right? That this thing has to be like this, but everything is not going to be as per our concept. So the moment we transcend that and see things as they are, that is when we can actually make a proper connection.
Remember also, she continued, that this is not easy, especially if one has to break away from a current codependent relationship. It is a real pulling apart of energy. It hurts, but it must be done. Codependence is not some new malady some of us have. We are all codependent and we are all growing out of it now.
So, what is codependence? That instead of connecting to the universal force, we are connecting to the force within the opposite sex and drawing energy from that opposite sex. Now, as soon as the opposite sex person feels that you are sucking energy out of them, they will attempt to suck the energy back. And that is when the competition starts. So, codependency is not very good. Co-independence is what we are looking for.
The idea is to begin to experience that sense of well being and euphoria experienced in the first moment of a codependent relationship when you are alone. You get to have him or her on the inside. After that, you evolve forward and can find that special romantic relationship that really fits you.
So if I am complete in my own self, then I'm not codependent or sucking energy from my partner. So I can let my partner be whole and be whole also. So both of us are independent. We really support each other. We feel good in each other's company, but we are not sucking energy out of the other person. So we let the other person be whole and still go through our evolutionary process.
She paused. And who knows if both you and Marjorie evolve further, perhaps you will find that you truly belong with each other. But understand, your relationship with her has no way of working now. Our conversation was interrupted as Hinton walked over and explained that he was retiring for the night and that our rooms had been prepared. We both expressed our appreciation for his hospitality, and as he walked away, Carla said, I think I'm going to bed also. We'll talk later. I nodded and watched as she left. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Julia. I'm going to my room, she said. Do you know where yours is? I can show you. Please, I said, then asked, where is Marjorie's room? She smiled as we walked down the hall and stopped in front of a particular door. Nowhere near yours, she said. Mr. Hinton is a very conservative man. I smiled back and bid her good night and then entered my room and held my stomach until I went to sleep.
So held my stomach till I went to sleep. Okay. So where do we feel the pressure? When we feel queasiness, we generally feel it in the stomach area.
I awoke to the smell of rich coffee. The aroma permeated the entire house. After I dressed, I walked into the den. An older male houseworker offered me a glass of fresh grape juice, which I accepted. Good morning, Julia said from behind me. I turned around. Good morning. She looked at me intensely, then asked, have you discovered yet why we've run into each other again? No, I said. I haven't been able to think about it. I've been trying to understand addictions. Yes, she replied. I saw. What do you mean? I could tell you what was happening by the way your energy field looked. How did it look? I asked. Your energy was connected to Marjorie's. When you were sitting here and she was in the other room, your field stretched all the way in there and attached to hers. I shook my head. She smiled and put her hand on my shoulder. You had lost your connection with the universe. You had become addicted to Marjorie's energy as a substitute. It is the same way with all addiction, one goes through someone or something else to connect with the universe. The way to deal with this is to get your energy up and then center yourself again in what you are really doing here.
So now this becomes important. Okay. One goes through, so when someone or something else is connected with the universe. A way to deal with this is to get your energy up and then center yourself. So your equanimity, your equilibrium, your connection with yourself and the universe becomes extremely important. Okay. And this is what we are all striving to do over here. Whichever process you use in somatic intelligence today, you will see that what Zia is attempting to do is again to get you centered, to get you into equanimity and equilibrium within yourself, to connect back to your body so that you can create that energy flow within yourself and to create resources within yourself which allow you to become whole.
I nodded and walked outside. She waited in the den. For about 10 minutes, I practiced the method of building energy that Sanchez had taught me. Gradually, the beauty returned and I felt much lighter. I returned to the house. You look better, Julia said. I feel better, I replied. So, what are your questions at this point? I thought for a minute. I had found Marjorie. That question had been answered. But I still wanted to find out where Will was. And I still wanted to understand how people would be acting towards each other if they followed this manuscript. If the manuscript's effect was positive, why would Sebastian and the other priests be worried? I looked at Julia. I need to grasp the rest of the eighth insight, and I still want to find Will. Maybe he has the ninth. I'm going to Equitos tomorrow. Would you like to go? I hesitated. I think Will is there, she added. How do you know? Because of the thoughts I had about him last night. I said nothing. I had thoughts of you too, Julia continued, of both of us going to Equitos. You're involved in this somehow. Involved in what? She grinned. In finding this last insight before Sebastian does. As she spoke, the image came to my mind of Julia and me arriving at Equitos, but then deciding to go in separate directions for some reason. I felt I had a purpose, but it was unclear. I focused again on Julia. She was smiling. Where were you? She asked. Sorry, I said. I was thinking about something. Was it important? I don't know. I was thinking that once we get to Equitos, that we would go in two different directions. Rolando came into the room. I bought the supplies you wanted, he said to Julia. He recognized me and nodded politely. Good, thank you, Julia replied. Did you see many soldiers? No, I did not see any, he said. Marjorie walked into the room then and distracted me, but I could hear Julia explaining to Rolando that she thought Marjorie wanted to go with him to Brazil, where she would arrange passage back to the States. I went over to Marjorie. How did you sleep? I asked. She looked at me as though deciding whether to remain angry. Not very well, she said.
So now this is important. Okay. She looked at me as though deciding whether to remain angry. So we actually make a decision to pull ourselves down and pull our energy down. Because if you're angry on the left side of the grid, right? So what's the point of remaining angry? It doesn't make sense at all.
I nodded towards Rolando. He is Julia's friend. He is leaving this morning for Brazil. From there, he will help you get back to the States. She appeared frightened. Look, you're going to be okay, I said. They've helped other Americans. They know people at the American embassy in Brazil. In no time, you will be home. She nodded. I'm worried about you. I'll be fine, don't worry. As soon as I get back to the US, I'll call you. From behind me, Hinton announced that breakfast was being served. We walked into the dining room and ate. Afterwards, Julia and Rolando seemed to be in a hurry. Julia explained that it was important for Rolando and Marjorie to get across the border before dark and the journey would take all day. Marjorie packed some clothes that Hinton had given her, and later, while Julia and Rolando were talking by the door, I pulled Marjorie to the side. Don't worry about anything, I said. Just keep your eyes open and perhaps you'll see the other insides. She smiled but said nothing. I watched with Julia as Rolando helped her load her things into the small car. Her eyes met mine briefly as they drove away. Do you think they will get through all right? I asked Julia. She looked at me and winked. Of course. And now we had better go as well. I have some clothes for you. She handed me a satchel of clothes, and we loaded these and several boxes of foodstuff into the pickup truck. We then said goodbye to Hinton and Carla and Moretta and drove northeast towards Equitos. As we traveled, the landscape grew even more jungle like, and we saw very few signs of people. I began thinking of the eighth insight. Clearly, it was a new understanding of how to treat others, but I didn't understand it completely. Carla had told me of the way one should treat children and the dangers of an addiction to a person, but both Pablo and Carla had alluded to a way of consciously project energy onto others. What was this about? I caught Julia's eyes and said, I haven't quite grasped the eighth insight. How we approach other people determines how quickly we evolve, how quickly our life questions are answered, she said. How does that work? I asked. Think about your own situations, she said. How have your questions been answered? By people who came along, I guess. Were you completely open to their messages? Not really. I was mainly aloof.
Okay, we can stop here. So again, we have to be open to what is coming into our life. We need to operate, or we need to live life with awareness. That is what the game is all about. If we live life with awareness, then we know what is happening around us. Otherwise, we are in a rut and we just keep going and we don't really know where we are going. Okay, anyone, anything?